We're going to close out the discussion of the golden age of comics by talking a little bit more about some of the publishing companies that were important that we haven't gone in depth about yet. Now, some of them we have mentioned, like Dell, for instance. Dell Publishing was established in the 1920s by George Delacorte Jr., who was born George Tonkanogy Jr., the son of Jewish Hungarian immigrants. He was from Brooklyn, and he got in initially on publishing comic strips. And then, if you will recall, when we were talking about the very first comic books back in 1929, it was Delacorte's company, Dell, that put out the Funnies, which is sort of like a prototype for the comic book. It was the newspaper insert of reprinted strips. Remember that? So he did that. Then in 1938, Dell's company, which was also, by the way, publishing pulp magazines and movie magazines and other kinds of magazines by the 30s. 1938, they went into a partnership with Little Golden Books owner Western Publishing, Whitman Western Publishing. So I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the Little Golden Books. They've been around for, I guess 90 years almost at this point. And Whitman Western, who made the Little Golden Books, they had licensing deals by 1938 with Disney and other companies. So they went into partnership with Dell. So you had Dell and Western. Western did the printing, and Dell did the distribution, essentially, and put up the initial money. So Dell and Western were a partnership until 1962. At which point, and during that time, by the way, the logos for the books they put out, some of them had Dell and some of them had Whitman. 1962, Dell and Western Publishing went their separate ways. And Western Publishing, when they left, took most of the talent with them, and also most of the contracts, most of the licensed contracts. So in 1962, they started a new corporation, a new logo, really, essentially. Gold Key. So from 1962 on, Whitman Western was doing most of the licensed stuff, and on the comics they had the Whitman logo or the Gold Key logo. The handful of things that Dell managed to hold on to had a Dell logo. So there. That's simple enough, isn't it? So Dell Western had the contract with Walt Disney by the late 1930s through the 1940s. By the late 1940s, they had licensed titles that they basically had gotten the rights to from all the major animation studios, or almost all of them, from Warner Brothers, the Looney Tunes characters, Bugs Bunny, Daffy Duck, and etc. From MGM, they had the Tom and Jerry characters, and the other MGM like Droopy and so forth, Andy Panda. They had the Universal Studios, Woody Woodpecker, and actually Woody Woodpecker was Andy Panda. So anyway, they had Andy Panda regardless. And the others, various other ones, they did not have Hanna-Barbera in the 1960s, but they had every other animation studio. And man, they sold a lot of comic books. One assumes that most of the kids buying these were the younger set. I know that early 1970s, I probably bought as many of these as I did superhero stuff, and I was still buying them when I was 8 or 9 years old. And that was in the 70s. So At their peak in 1953, Dell / Whitman / Goldkey not only was the top publisher, they had 1/3 of the market share, despite the fact they only had 15% of the actual titles. So what that means is they had fewer titles, but those titles they had sold a whole lot. How much is a whole lot? 26 million copies a month. Now, DC, I think, National / DC at their peak, managed to be selling maybe 5 or 6 million copies a month. All comic book companies put together as of December 2019 were selling about 5 or 6 million copies per month. But Dell alone was selling 26 million in 1953. And that's 1/3 of the market share. So that means there were about 78 million comic books being sold each month in 1953. And of course, in addition to the various licensed products they had, Dell was also producing their own original content and their own original characters, most famously Turok, Son of Stone, which I am told that some college students are familiar with now because it's a video game. Anyway, that's from Dell. And Magnus Robot Fighter was another of their big ones, and several more. Easily the most famous and most critically acclaimed artist to work for Dell / Western was Carl Barks, who passed away in the year 2000 at the age of 99 and had spent a good part of his life drawing ducks. He was called the Duck Man. He was in charge of the stories and art. Most of the stories. Sometimes he did the artwork from other stories, but mostly it was all him. For all of the duck-related Disney comics, beginning in the early 1940s. So we're talking about Walt Disney Comics and Stories. That was one of the titles. Donald Duck and so on. He created the town of Duckburg. You will see Duckburg referenced in Disney cartoons made in recent decades, but it didn't originate there. It originated on the printed page from the mind of Carl Barks, whom Will Eisner called the Hans Christian Andersen of comic books. So in addition to creating Duckburg, there's a lot of other stuff connected to the Donald Duck family mythos that came not from the animated cartoons, but from the pen or the brush of Carl Barks. I say the brush, in addition to doing the penciling and inking of these comics later in life, he started doing fairly lush paintings reproducing some of his covers. So anyway, he created Scrooge McDuck, Uncle Scrooge. First appeared in a Donald Duck comic book. He did not create Huey, Dewey, and Louie. They originated in the cartoons, but he did come up with the idea of them being in a Cub Scout-like outfit called the Junior Woodchucks. He also came up with the Beagle Boys, who, again, they show up in cartoons made in the last several decades, but not from cartoons of the 30s and early 40s. The Beagle Boys are those 4 brothers that are escaped cons. They're still wearing their prison outfits, and they're known by their prison numbers, not by their names, who are always trying to steal Scrooge McDuck's money. He created Magica Dispel, Uncle Scrooge's arch nemesis, the Duck Witch, Gyro Gearloose, the inventor in the employ of Uncle Scrooge, who showed up a lot in the old DuckTales cartoons in the 90s, and I understand there's a new DuckTales, and that the new one, in order, I guess, to establish their own identity, have changed the design and the art style of the characters. The 1990s version looked a lot like the Carl Barks characters. So now I would just like to take just a few seconds to allow you to scroll through or to watch through and see some of the samples of Carl Barks's duckwork. So Dell Western had pretty much all the licensed characters that were licensed characters. They had all the major comic strip heroes, all the major pulp heroes, or most of them, the major cowboy stars from the movies. They had once the 50s came along and television became a thing, they started having the most popular television shows. They weren't necessarily that good. That is to say, well, the writing wasn't that good and the art wasn't that good. Some of them were, but overall it was kind of had kind of a slap together kind of feel to it sometimes. But it had that brand name that people recognized, and they grabbed them up. Here are some examples of TV shows from the 1950s that they had at the time. They had Roy Rogers and Lassie, Have Gun, Will Travel, I Love Lucy. In the 60s, they had I Dream of Jeannie and Bewitched and Mission Impossible. And, of course, Doc Savage, which was not a TV show. It was a pulp hero, but they were still putting out his adventures in the 60s. Now, these were not the only ones they had. This is just a random sampling. All the way up into the 1970s, they were still producing licensed comics based on television shows, including The Twilight Zone, Star Trek. The first Star Trek comics were the Dell/Gold Key Star Trek comics of the early 70s. And again, they weren't that great, but they were there. Dark Shadows and even, yes, the Mod Squad. Talking about Dell Comics and their licensed characters makes me want to share with you some of the things that I've got in my office here at home for decorative purposes. I've got the Dell Comics Have Gun, Will Travel, which was on one of the slides we just looked at. That's Paladin, the star of the show. If you're not familiar with it, he's a gunfighter in this 1950s Western who has a business card with a chess piece, a knight, that says, "Have gun, will travel." So I've got that. I've also got an issue here of the Dell Comics Gunsmoke. That's a little flashy there. There's Marshall Matt Dillon. And one other thing I'll show you that is not a Dell comic. It is a Marvel comic from the early 60s. It is the first appearance of the Silver Age Two-Gun Kid, autographed there by creator and writer Stan Lee. In addition to those treasures, something else that I found, actually that my mother gave me recently, was one of those underground comics, one of those unofficial, unlicensed, bootleg comics that features those Looney Tunes characters, but done by one in 1980. This is from 1980. This is by one Troy D. Smith, editor, writer, penciler, inker, and colorist. For what it's worth, this is the Dopes of Hazardous. It is a Mad Magazine-like parody of the Dukes of Hazzard, with characters from Looney Tunes playing the various characters, including, this is my favorite, Foghorn Leghorn as Waylon Jiltings. You're welcome. Harvey Comics was another big player. Not so big during the Golden Age. They were sort of a bit player on the periphery, doing funny animal comics for the most part. It wasn't until really the early 1950s that they started to really take hold in the comics marketplace. Now, Dell was not the only company to have licensed characters, though, as I pointed out, they had, seemed like 99% of them. Harvey Comics got the rights to two cartoon characters, two animated cartoon characters from famous studios, Little Audrey and Casper the Friendly Ghost. And that's what sort of gave Harvey a push so far as sales go, because the kids were familiar, particularly with Casper. There were 55 Casper cartoon shorts produced. So a whole kind of coterie of other characters came about in the 50s that would be closely associated with Casper. Little Audrey kind of fell by the wayside. Baby Huey, who was a big baby chicken. Wendy, the friendly witch. Richie Rich, that poor little rich kid. Hot Stuff, the devil in diapers. And Herman and Catnip, another cat and mouse combo. So Harvey did pretty well. These characters had their own titles, and some of them, like Casper and Richie Rich, had multiple titles by the 1970s. Now, Dell and Harvey are going to go into decline around 1980 in the early 80s. But until then, Harvey Comics too has a strong foothold in the comics market. By the way, in 1959, they bought the character Casper outright, not just the rights to do comics, but they, from that point forward, owned Casper. All right, so that leaves us with the following major players during the Golden Age and right toward the end of it. We've mentioned some other companies, but these are the major ones. National, alias DC. Timely, which would become Atlas, which would eventually become Marvel. Quality, which would eventually go under and be bought by DC. Fawcett, which would eventually go under and be bought by DC, both in the 50s. Dell / Whitman / Gold Key. Harvey, and EC. Now, EC, I've mentioned, I've alluded to a few times already, but we haven't really gotten down to discussing where they come in. And they came in in 1944, but they really started coming into their own in the late 40s. Well, now, finally, we're going to go into a little detail about EC Comics. And that story, like many of the ones we've told so far, begins with Max C. Gaines, born Max Ginsberg. Max Gaines, of course, was the mastermind behind the first real comic book, Famous Funnies. He had then gone into a partnership with Jack Leibowitz, and by doing so, kind of a end-about partnership with Harry Donenfeld, in order to form All American Comics, which sort of was running concurrently with National/DC, and had a DC logo on it. 1944, as we've previously discussed, he sold out to Leibowitz and left that venture. Unlike Major Malcolm Wheeler Nichols, who was sort of kind of forced out without any money, Gaines was able to at least leave with something. And with that, he used that as startup funds for a new comic book company, which he called Educational Comics, or EC. He also, as part of the deal for selling his interest in All American to DC, kept picture stories from the Bible, kept the rights to it. So his new company, EC, just picked up on publishing that. So you'll notice on the upper left, you have an issue of Picture Stories from the Bible with a DC logo. And on the lower right, we've gotten to the New Testament by this point. That one has an EC, Educational Comics logo. Now, let's take a look at the characters that he had signed away when he sold All American. That's characters like the Green Lantern, Wonder Woman, the Flash, Hawkman. One could say that since this deal was made in 1944, he was a little bit ahead of the curve, because just the following year, the superhero comics would start to go into decline. And that would make it seem like a pretty smart business move on his part to get out when he did, because there's going to be new trends around the corner, and he'll be in a position to have the opportunity to take advantage of them. Except he wasn't all that interested. He called his company Educational Comics, and his intent was to produce educational comics. So in addition to picture stories from the Bible, you wound up with picture stories from American history and picture stories of science, amazing discoveries about food and health. Also, there were some children's comics that they put out, including Tiny Tot Comics, your first comic magazine. And this issue is talking about how wonderful it is to go back to school. And Animal Fables, which is funny animal stories, but with a lesson. They also got the rights, licensed the rights, to do a comic book version of a popular children's radio drama called Land of the Lost, about two kids, brother and sister, that get lost at the bottom of the ocean and find this new world where, there are fish people and stuff. So it's kind of sort of an adventure, but we're talking about like second, third grade level, I guess. It was kind of loosely reinterpreted in 1974 in the children's TV show Land of the Lost that you might be familiar with. Now, Gaines's goal was, well, of course, to sell these things on the newsstand for 10 cents like everybody else was, but he also believed that he would get a big market boost by selling these things in bulk to schools and libraries. Well, he didn't. The schools and libraries weren't really biting that much, and the kids perusing the comic book racks would skip right over the history of nutrition or funny adventures about how wonderful school is and, go to the fun stuff, I guess you could say. Now, you might think things are starting to look grim for Max Gaines, and you'd be right, because then he died on August 21st, 1947, at the age of 52, in a boating accident on Lake Placid. His speedboat plowed headfirst into another speedboat, and he and one of his passengers were killed. So that makes a lot of his plans moot. Max Gaines's death left the company in the hands of his son, William Gaines, or Bill Gaines, who was 25 years old. Actually the same age that Stan Lee was that same year when he released his booklet about how to write comic books. The big difference between Bill Gaines and Stan Lee is that Bill Gaines did not want to be in the comic book business. In fact, he hated the idea. He had served 4 years in the Army Air Corps throughout World War II, had come home in 1946, and on the GI Bill had been able to start college, where his dream was to become a high school chemistry teacher, which in this picture he kind of looks like a high school chemistry teacher from the 1940s. However, he didn't have a whole lot of choice. Now, if it had been a successful company, he could have just sold it, right? Maybe even made a profit. But the fact is, EC had not been a successful company. They weren't making money. They had been losing money. And the family was deeply in debt. So getting rid of the business wasn't an option because that would still leave them up the creek. So he had no choice for the sake of the family, and for himself, for his obligations, than to take over, to relinquish his dream of teaching, which he never got to do, and take over as publisher of EC. However, he did make a bold move in that he decided that as long as he has to be in charge of the comic book business, maybe they could make comic books people would actually buy. So he changed the name of the company from Educational Comics to Entertaining Comics. So still EC. He hired some new people who had been working at various studios or comic companies. Usually the people that he was able to bring over either hadn't made a name for themselves yet or had been toiling away and were sort of like second, third string people at this time. So brought them over and added some titles to the lineup. Titles that were more in keeping with what the trends were in 1947 and 48. A couple of Western comics, including Gunfighter, a romance comic, Modern Love, and jumping in on the crime bandwagon, Crime Patrol and War Against Crime, which, remember, the height of the crime comics was 1948. That means they started declining after that. So his company got in on the crime comics fad just as it was about to peak and start ending. So that was poor timing. But all that changed in 1950 because of these two guys, Al Feldstein and Harvey Kurtzman. They had both come over in 1948 or so when Bill Gaines was kind of expanding things. Kurtzman had been working for the Iger studio, Jerry Iger's studio, and for that studio, he had been doing things like backgrounds for Quality Comics and others. In other words, like filling in just kind of the boring, mundane stuff behind the heroes. And Al Feldstein had been working at Timely, where he had been, among other things, writing those 2-page text things. He did about 150 of them. In other words, all the ones that Mickey Spillane didn't do, Al Feldstein probably did. So they came over initially as artists. That's an interesting thing about these two guys. Both of them could write really well and draw really well, and had editorial skills. So they moved up the ranks pretty quickly. Both of them were from Brooklyn. Both of them were Jewish. Harvey Kurtzman was the son of Ukrainian immigrants. Feldstein's parents, so far as I know, were not immigrants, but I think that his grandparents might have been. Anyway, in 1950, they became the guiding force behind Bill Gaines's EC Comics. They became the editors, co-editors, essentially. And they had envisioned a whole new direction because they foresaw that the various trends that Bill Gaines had invested in, westerns and romance and crime, were already on their way out, like we just said, and they anticipated what the next trend was going to be. And that was horror. So EC Comics got out ahead of that. They canceled all of their books. Or if they didn't cancel them, they renamed them and essentially started over. So all those things that we talked about not being published anymore as of 1950. Instead, they had, as of that year, kind of a core of 7 titles. 3 horror titles: Tales from the Crypt, The Vault of Horror, and The Haunt of Fear. 2 science fiction titles, Weird Fantasy and Weird Science, both of which had sort of, at times, some horror elements in them. They started a new crime series, Crime Suspense Stories, and Two-Fisted Tales, which initially was, well, as it says there, He-Man Adventure, tales of He-Man adventure from various places around the world at various times. But this is 1950, and by the end of the year, the Korean War is going to be underway. So Two-Fisted Tales, although it does include sometimes other things like Civil War stories, the mainstay becomes Korean War stories. So 1950, these 7 debut. Then in 1951, Frontline Combat, taking advantage of the renewed interest in war since there was another one. And in 1952, Shock Suspense Stories, and something completely different, Mad, a humor magazine. Humor in a jugular vein.